let's look at trauma and its impact on the brain. So first, let's talk about what trauma actually is. On your worksheet, we'd love you to take a moment and complete this sentence. Of course, pause the video if you need to. Trauma is. How would you define trauma? So here's how we define trauma. It's a sort of multi-part definition. So first, trauma is emotionally painful or distressing experiences. This can mean physical too, but the emotional component is really key. So emotionally painful and distressing experiences that overwhelm someone's ability to cope. So this means that two people might experience very similar or the same event, and one person might find it traumatic while the other person doesn't. And this is because, for whatever reason, it's exceeding one of those people's ability to cope. Lastly, it leaves them feeling powerless. Again, this really differs for different people, but generally, some amount of time feeling powerless is part of experiencing trauma. So, what can we conclude from this definition? I think one thing to really keep in mind is that trauma is a highly emotional and a highly personal experience. It's not going to be the same for everyone. So what is actually happening when someone experiences any traumatic event? This could be anything from an accident, a natural disaster, to abuse in the home. There are lots of different things that can be going on. When a traumatic event happens, we're probably familiar with this, you've heard of this. The brain goes into fight, flight, freeze mode. We really don't have any control over this. It just happens. It's coming from that kind of limbic system of our brain. We don't even have control over whether our brain picks fight, flight, or freeze. That just happens too. And so what is really going on is that our brain is dropping down into its lower functions. The higher logical reasoning parts of our brain just go offline, and the instinctual emotional parts really take over. So all of us have experienced traumatic incidents when our brain goes into this kind of fight, flight, freeze place. And generally that happens for a short amount of time, and then our brain returns to its typical functioning. But what if this happens more than once, especially during childhood? And what if this happens more than once during childhood when a kid is young enough not to have any idea what is happening? And what if it happens with someone that they are hardwired to love and care about, and who is supposed to keep them safe? So what we see then is that the brain sort of gets trapped in the fight, flight, freeze, survival mode. And it spends more and more of its time there. And so it sort of gets used to being there. And that becomes its new reality. So when this can happen, what we start to see is really more permanent changes in the brain. So instead of a brain that's focused on learning and growth, we have a brain focused and wired around survival. So what does this actually look like? So first, survival brains are actually physically smaller than learning brains because they've had to devote so many more resources towards survival. They also haven't been able to grow in other ways, and so they don't process things as efficiently as learning-oriented brains. Survival-oriented brains are looking for really clear answers, and they often struggle with ambiguity. So this really makes sense from a survival perspective. You're either safe or you aren't. There's not a lot of room there for sort of perspective taking or for nuance. Survival brains also tend to get really focused on particular things and can be kind of panicky about those things, which again, makes a lot of sense. Knowing what is dangerous and being a bit obsessed with that is a survival skill. Survival-oriented brains have not had the time or the space to devote resources to developing all that prefrontal cortex stuff. So controlling emotions is more difficult. Survival brains are stuck in that more emotional place. They have more trouble accessing that rational, logical place. Making a mistake can be truly scary when one is in survival mode. So it's easy to see how, after enough time, that would kind of spill out into being afraid to make a mistake generally. Imagine if, when you were younger, every time your parent thought you messed up, you were hit. You might not be able to identify it, but that would absolutely impact how you thought about making mistakes in other parts of your life later on. Lastly, survival-oriented brains often have difficulty forming relationships, often for all of the reasons listed above, but also because trusting others is hard to do when someone has experienced damaging relationships when they were young.